Hello, my name is Vince Greenwood, and I am Director of the Washington Center for Cognitive Therapy. In this conversation, I will be discussing social anxiety. I will define what social anxiety is, talk about the difference between social anxiety and shyness, two different phenomena, go over some of the interesting and useful research, useful since it has led to well-informed treatment strategies, and spell out the treatment of social anxiety. There is a scientifically proven effective treatment of social anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'll try to give you a picture of what that treatment looks like. Now, social anxiety is defined as an intense fear of social situations. Individuals with such intense anxiety then avoid the situations that trigger the anxiety. And the avoidance is significant. It can interfere with the person's daily functioning and prevent them from meeting important personal goals, such as developing friendships or intimate relationships, or performing the way they need to or want to at work. The heart of the disorder is that those with it believe others are scrutinizing, judging them sharply, and forming negative opinions of them. They worry other people will find them boring or inept. They constantly monitor the impression they are making on people and are painfully self-conscious. People with social anxiety are not just feeling awkward or shy in social situations, they typically have physical symptoms in social or performance situations, such as blushing, sweating, trembling, nausea, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, lightheadedness, feeling a loss of control. When they have these painful physical symptoms, they believe they are being displayed in an obvious manner, which only increases their fear of being judged negatively. There are three subtypes of social anxiety. These subtypes are based on the kinds of situations that trigger the anxiety. The most common type is a general fear of social interactions. Fear of dating, going to a party, joining in a conversation, engaging in small talk, and so on. For others, the painful anxiety occurs in the performance arena, giving a talk in front of a group of people, speaking up in a work meeting, performing on the stage or athletic field. Now, some people suffer from what we call observational fears, which are fears of doing things in front of others. The essence of the difficulty here is the fear of making a mistake or doing something embarrassing, such as knocking over a beverage in a restaurant, or that your hand will shake if you try to sign a document in front of others. People with this concern then avoid those situations where they feel this might happen. So, social anxiety is not just shyness in a few situations. It's a distinct and painful disorder that the sufferer recognizes is excessive and unreasonable and often comes to dominate one's life. It has been linked to difficulties in educational achievement, lower lifetime earnings, and increased risk of medical problems and clinical depression. Social anxiety is a fairly prevalent disorder, ranking only behind depression and alcoholism. It affects about 4% of the population in any one year. What causes social anxiety? Like most anxiety disorders, it appears to be a mix of genetics and environment. Individuals with social anxiety may have grown up in families where one or both parents may have modeled social anxiety, conveyed to the child that social situations were somehow dangerous. Also, social anxiety sufferers report a history of a painful childhood experience, either some particularly embarrassing moment or the sense that they were somehow different than their peers. In understanding social anxiety, researchers and clinicians have found it helpful to think of social anxiety as having three parts, three components, what we call the tripartite model of social anxiety. First, there are the physical symptoms that I mentioned earlier, the blushing, rapid heartbeat, sinking sensation in the gut. These are the most painful aspects of the disorder and what people are hoping to alleviate with treatment. The cognitive or thinking component, of course, are the thoughts that someone with social anxiety has when they are in or anticipate going into a social situation. Now, I'd like to elaborate on some of the research on this thinking component because what we have learned about this component has helped lay the foundation for effective treatment. The first point is that individuals with social anxiety are less tuned into their thoughts than to their feelings. They are painfully aware of their feelings and of vulnerability and their self-consciousness, but not so aware of the thoughts that generate the feelings of self-consciousness. So, a person with social anxiety getting ready to go to a party might be acutely aware of a feeling of dread and a sinking feeling in their stomach, but not so aware of such thoughts as, I won't know what to say, or people will think I'm boring, or what if I blush? This thinking component, even though it may not be the one that social anxiety sufferer is most aware of, plays a central role in maintaining the anxiety, and therefore is a primary ingredient in the treatment model for social anxiety. We know that when individuals with social anxiety come into a social situation, that they would like to focus their attention on others and throw themselves into the social situation, but because they feel threatened, they can't help but focus on themselves. And that means often focusing on their own anxious thoughts and feelings, which they then, mistakenly, take as confirmation for their worst fears. For example, an individual with social anxiety might imagine how they appear to the other person and imagine they are displaying their anxiety in a conspicuous manner. Admittedly, they may feel anxious in social situations, may feel, for example, that they're blushing, but they picture themselves as beet red and sweat pouring down their face. Research has demonstrated that these images are almost always grossly distorted. Many studies have shown that individuals with social anxiety significantly overestimate the visibility of their anxiety symptoms compared to ratings by objective viewers. Research on social anxiety has highlighted the tendency to look at social or performance situations through what one psychologist called amber-colored glasses. You've heard of rose-colored glasses. Well, amber-colored glasses are the opposite. Since individuals with social anxiety view social situations as threatening, they look for signals in the other person and how the interaction is going and their own thoughts and feelings, signals that might alert them to danger. But in doing so, they don't mean to, it's the amber-colored glasses, their thinking out of this fear becomes distorted, not an accurate reflection of reality. We've identified some of the more frequently occurring distortions and given them labels. One of them is called fortune-telling or catastrophizing. This is where the person in their thinking goes into the future and makes a particularly negative prediction. Thoughts like, I know I won't have anything to say at the party, or I'm going to mess up this interview, I'll probably never get a good job, are examples of that. Another amber-colored thinking distortion is emotional reasoning, where you think something must be true because you feel it so strongly. An example of that would be, I'm feeling anxious, so this conversation must be going poorly. Another distortion is to disqualify the positive. This is illustrated in such thoughts as, it went okay on that date only because she was so easy to talk to, and they were being nice when they just laughed at my jokes. And there are many other distortions as well. The third piece of social anxiety is the behavioral component. Behavior refers to things the person actually does, things you can observe. Now, there are three types of behavior that we assess in social anxiety. The first two typically play a large role in maintaining the disorder. The first behavior we call avoidance, which is exactly what it sounds like, where the person avoids social or performance situations. Since in social anxiety, the person defines social situations as dangerous, there is an understandable natural tendency to avoid such situations. Now, what happens when a person avoids such a situation? Well, yeah, they do get the immediate relief of not going into the situation that provokes the anxiety, but more importantly, they reinforce in their behavior, but also in their minds, that the situation is dangerous and needs to be avoided. The second type of behavior we call safety behavior. This is where the person puts himself or finds himself in a social situation, but does something to reduce their perceived threat in the situation. So, for example, someone may push themselves to go to a party, but only allow themselves to talk to one or two close friends. Or they might wear a lot of makeup to cover up the possibility of blushing. The third type of behavior involves social skills. Now, the first thing to say here is that most individuals with social anxiety believe they have poor social skills. However, research demonstrates that this view is false, that individuals with social anxiety don't have any social skills deficits compared to people without social anxiety. And their belief that they do represents an overly harsh, self-critical view. Nevertheless, it can be helpful to go over some social skills like maintaining eye contact, being a careful listener in a conversation, skills that generally go along with positive social interactions. Treatment of social anxiety. I'd like to now give you a thumbnail sketch of how treatment unfolds for someone seeking help for social anxiety. The first step is to determine if the person suffers from social anxiety and not just shyness. We make sure they meet the diagnostic criteria for social anxiety, which are, 1, the client recognizes the fear is excessive and that most people would not be as frightened in a similar situation. Secondly, the person must avoid the situations that cause anxiety or suffer through them with great distress. And the social anxiety must interfere with the person's life in important ways, such as keeping them from dating, doing well in school, or doing as well as they want in work. The next step is to determine whether someone with social anxiety is ready to start treatment. We do this by assessing their motivation and describe the treatment, what will be asked of them, so that they can decide whether they want to embark on treatment. We let them know that treatment will require a lot of time and energy and taking on situations that are challenging. Most social anxiety sufferers are ready to commit to treatment, and their motivation comes from realizing that social anxiety prevents them from having the life experiences that they want, that they no longer want to be standing painfully on the sidelines of life activities, and they want to take steps to meet important personal goals. They will be informed that they will be asked to endure some discomfort. They will be asked to take on social situations that frighten them, but this will be done gradually and not until the person has developed some new coping skills to deal with those situations. Treatment does not mean jumping into the deep end of the pool of your anxiety. It's more like starting out in the shallow end with guidance and new coping skills, but it does require an emotional investment. We ask clients to invest anxiety in a calmer future, which means facing your fears in order to overcome them. We share the research findings on this treatment. At this point, there have been dozens of studies demonstrating that cognitive behavioral therapy with social anxiety, that approximately 80% of the people that go through the treatment report significant improvement, both in the reduction of painful anxiety symptoms and the increase in their freedom to take on challenging but fulfilling opportunities in their lives. The treatment begins with a careful assessment of all the components of the social anxiety, as well as pinpointing the situations that trigger the anxiety. Identifying the situations that trigger the anxiety will later turn into a list, a hierarchy of situations they will be asked to take on, again, starting at the shallow end of the pool. So we begin by identifying the distressing physical symptoms the person has in the situation, and then we particularly emphasize identifying the thoughts that go along with and contribute to the social anxiety. In order to help clients identify the thoughts implicated in their anxiety, we have found it useful to present vignettes of others who suffer social anxiety and the typical thoughts they might have, such as, I will make a fool of myself, my mind will go blank, everyone will see how nervous I look. Presenting such vignettes helps clients tune in to their own thoughts and recognize the importance of them. It can also help people not feel so unique in their suffering and overcome feelings of shame or embarrassment about having these kinds of thoughts. As we collect the thoughts that will be a focus of change strategies, we establish some principles about these thoughts, such as thoughts are important. They play a large role in creating feelings. Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts can be distorted, and that's something that we are going to investigate. Some thoughts are not helpful, and we have the ability to develop thoughts that are more helpful. After we have identified the key thoughts that plague the person with social anxiety, we start the process of examining them and, where appropriate, challenging them and developing more constructive thinking. There are many techniques to help people counteract their negative thinking. A good place to start is collaboratively with the client, see if we can identify any distortions in their thinking. Are they having fortune-telling thoughts like, I know I'm going to sweat visibly in this work meeting this week? Or an emotional reasoning thought such as, I feel foolish, so I must look foolish. Identifying possible distortions in one's thinking gets the ball rolling in terms of turning around the thinking. We teach clients to take their anxiety-producing thoughts and subject them to questions such as, do I know for certain that this negative outcome I'm predicting will happen? What good evidence do I really have to support a thought like, I'm going to make a fool of myself? We encourage clients to consider that things may not go exquisitely well in a particular situation, but then to ask themselves, what really is the worst that could happen? For example, if you stumbled over words in a meeting or someone declined your invitation for coffee, could you imagine coping with that? We have questions designed to break up false equivalencies. A false equivalency is where you equate a particular behavior or a particular moment with something of much greater significance or permanence. Examples of false equivalencies might be looking nervous equals looking foolish, being rejected equals being alone forever, blushing equals looking stupid, and the really key one for social anxiety is feeling anxious equals looking anxious. What comes out of this sincere questioning and challenging are some new, realistic, accurate, and compassionate thoughts the client believes are honest, so they can work on internalizing them with conviction. This brings us to what we call the exposure part of the treatment. This is where we ask the client to put themselves in social situations they have been avoiding or causing them anxiety. We do this in a gradual manner, with a certain kind of structure the therapist provides, and when the client has mastered some of the coping strategies. Before I tell you how the exposure works, let me first outline why it works. Exposure is helpful in at least 4 ways. The first reason is habituation. This refers to the fact that if you stay in a situation that makes you anxious, your anxiety will eventually level off and then decrease. What so often happens with social anxiety, actually most anxiety disorders, is that the person leaves the situation before they have the experience of the anxiety trailing off. The second reason is practice. Putting yourself in the situation gives you a chance to practice how to act in these situations that make you anxious. Third, it helps with the identification of important thoughts that are driving the anxiety. Sometimes the really important thoughts only occur to you when you're right in the situation. It is vital to identify what we call these hot cognitions so they can be counteracted. Finally, of course, putting yourself in the situation is the fundamental strategy to test out whether your thinking is accurate. For example, if someone has the thought, if I try to talk to this guy and there's a long silence, I won't be able to handle it, the most powerful challenge is to put yourself in the situation and discover whether you can handle it. How is the exposure part of the treatment conducted? Well, in the assessment stage of treatment, we secured a list of situations that triggered anxiety and rank ordered them in terms of the intensity of the anxiety. We are going to start with the situation on the lower end of that anxiety scale, but one that is relevant to the client's goals in therapy. So, if the goal is to feel more comfortable with small talk, we might start with initiating a brief conversation with someone standing next to you at an elevator or sitting next to you on the bus or train. If the goal is to be more comfortable speaking up at work, we might start with initiating a few extra conversations with colleagues or making a brief comment at a meeting where you are not the designated speaker. Then, before going into the situation, we work on the thoughts that are likely to pop up in the situation. We challenge those thoughts in the therapy session, the important thoughts, and train people to ask the questions we mentioned earlier. Third, we set a specific behavioral goal for the exposure, such as introducing yourself to 2 people at a party or speaking up once in a work meeting. We want to make these goals realistic and specific, not vague and demanding, like I've got to be funny at this party. And we certainly don't want to have the goal of being anxiety-free in the situation. Remember, experiencing the anxiety is one of the benefits of the exposure. To have the experience of seeing yourself cope with the anxiety and having the experience of seeing the anxiety taper off. Then, we typically do a role play of the situation in the therapist's office. We try to simulate the situation, and the client gets practice not only with their behavior, such as starting a conversation at a party or giving a report to your work colleagues, but also their thinking. What we find is, even though it is a simulation, the role play does trigger anxiety, often nearly as much as the real life situation. And that's good because what we can do in the role play and what we couldn't do as easily, of course, in the real situation is to monitor the anxiety level. The therapist will ask the client to report when he has high levels of anxiety and then identify and articulate the thoughts that are popping up and fueling the anxiety. Then we can work on responding to those thoughts. The role play really helps lay the groundwork for going into the first situation we've chosen to work on. After the individual takes on that first situation, we have what we call a debriefing, highlighted by the following questions. Did the client meet the behavioral goal? What were the problematic thoughts that came up? How successful was the client in combating these thoughts? What about the level of anxiety while in the situation? Did it taper off? Overall, what evidence did we gain with the exposure, especially as it relates to the negative thinking? This debriefing sets the stage for continuing to work on the important thoughts. Then, depending on the client's comfort level, we go back into the same kind of situation, or we take on a situation that is a bit more challenging. Treatment now involves working through the list of situations. The hoped-for goals and what the research suggests is that the majority of people will experience reduced anxiety so that it doesn't interfere with day-to-day functioning and perhaps more importantly, doesn't thwart them from pursuing important personal goals. At the end of treatment, we go over the basic relapse prevention principles, which include 1, avoid avoidance. Every time you avoid a situation that makes you anxious, you reward the anxiety and make it worse. Try to decrease the avoidance to 0, even if it means experiencing some anxiety. 2, keep using the thought-challenging strategies. When you have recurring anxieties, there are almost always elements in your thinking that deserve challenging. 3, view an increase in anxiety as an opportunity. The mission of the treatment program is not to make one immune from anxiety, but to give one the tools to deal with it. And reward yourself for your success. Facing one's fears takes courage and motivation. This deserves to be acknowledged and even celebrated as you move off the sidelines to pursue important goals. Thank you for listening. And please note, there are excellent self-help books on social anxiety and helpful online resources. Please feel free to go to the Washington Center for Cognitive Therapy to get links for some of these resources. Thank you.